B'siyata deshmaya, we're going to learn Yoma Daf Daled. We're going to start on Daf Gimel Amud Beis, 9 lines from the bottom of the Amud. In the previous Gemara, we saw at length that Rabbi Yochanan learns from a pasuk in the parasha of the Miluim, the inauguration of the Mishkan, that in the same way that there was a 7-day separation period in preparation for the avodah of the last day of the Miluim, so too before Yom Kippur there was a 7-day separation where they would put the Kohen into this chamber in order to prepare him and to make sure he stays tahir to be able to do the avodah on Yom Kippur. Rish Lakish is now asking Rabbi Yochanan, where did you learn? What was your source, you Rabbi Yochanan, that to what we saw in the Mishnah on Daf Beis Amud Aleph, that the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur gets separated and put into this chamber and taken care of there the 7 days before Yom Kippur? Miluim, you learned it from the pasuk of the Miluim. So Shlokish says, if so, I've got an issue. Ima Miluim, kolakosov behen, ma'akiv behen. We're going to see in the Gemara later on Daf Hey that everything that it says in the parasha of the Miluim was ma'akiv. It was, if you didn't do it, it would be possible. Avhacha, are you going to suggest that so too all the halachas of the Prisha regarding Yom Kippur, Nami kolakosov behen, ma'akiv behen, that we learn one from the other? Are you going to say that the 7 days of Prisha is ma'akiv by Yom Kippur, and the Kohen who didn't do the 7 days Prisha before Yom Kippur, he would not be kosher to do the avodah? Can that be so? And are you going to suggest that yes, maybe it is so? What's your reservation against that? It can't be. Votnan, we learnt in the Mishnah, umaskinin loy kohen acher. We saw in our Mishnah that besides for separating the kohen from his home and making him or putting him into this chamber for 7 days, besides for that, they would prepare a second kohen in his place in case he became tomei, that another kohen would be able to replace him. And it doesn't say in the Mishnah that that second kohen was also had to do prisha. It says, Shivas Yomim Koidim Yom Kippurim Mafrishin Kohen Gadol, the Kohen Gadol, the acting, serving Kohen Gadol, he would be separated before the week before. And besides for that, Maskinim, they would prepare a second Kohen, just in case. Well, is that second Kohen going to do a Prisha? It doesn't say that in the Mishnah. It doesn't say that that second Kohen gets separated, and in the event that the first Kohen becomes Tomei and cannot do the Avodah, then the second, the reserve Kohen, he would do the Avodah on Yom Kippur, even though he did not do the Prisha. If you, Rabbi Yochanan, are learning the Prisha of Yom Kippur from the Prisha of Miluim, and the Prisha of Miluim we know is Ma'akev, then how are you going to understand the Mishnah? V'chi Teima, are you going to suggest my maskinin mafrishin, that the word maskinim, which we translated as preparing a second kohen, actually means mafrishin, separating a second kohen from his home and bringing him to the lishka? Then if so, why are you using two terms in the Mishnah? Mafrishin regarding the first kohen and maskinin regarding the second kohen. Use the same term for both. Lisni, oi idi v'idi maskinin. Either use the term maskinin for both kohenim, oi idi v'idi mafrishin, or use the term mafrishin for both. Why are you changing? Omar le Rabbi Yochanan answered to Rish Lakish as follows. Omar mar, elomar. So okay, you, my master, you're Rish Lakish. So you don't agree with me. You don't agree that the source of, or you assume that the Mishnah, it's apparent from the Mishnah that it's not Ma'akev, the Prisha of Yom Kippur. And if it's not Ma'akev, it cannot be learned from Miluim, where it is Ma'akev. Okay, so where do you, Rish Lakish, learn? What's the source that you have to be Mafrish the Kohen 7 days before Yom Kippur? Elomar meheicha yalifla. Omar misinai. By Sinai, there's a pasuk that tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu, before going right into the Shechina, into the closest place of in Shemayim, near Hashem, so to speak, that he had a 7-day preparation, a 7-day separation. And I learned from Sinai to Yom Kippur that the same way as going to the Shechina by Sinai, there needed a separation period, so too going into the Kodesh HaKadoshim on Yom Kippur needs a separation. It says in the pasuk by Sinai, it says, "Vayishkoin kvoid Hashem al Har Sinai." Hashem's honor rested on Mount Sinai. Vayichasehu ha'onon, and the cloud covered it. Doesn't tell us exactly what the it is, whether it's referring to the mountain or referring to Moshe Rabbeinu. But the cloud covered it, Sheishes Yomim, for the duration of 6 days. Vayikra el Moshe b'yom hashvi, and on the 7th day, Hashem called to Moshe, mitaycha onon, from within the cloud, inviting Moshe Rabbeinu. That's what it says in the Pasuk. Says the Gemara, Mechte ksiv vayikra el Moshe b'yom hashvi. So some don't add in these words, but the point of the Gemara is, my sheishes yomim. What are these 6 days? It says that the mountain, that the cloud covered. Let's assume that it covered Moshe Rabbeinu, which is what we are assuming at this point, according to this opinion, according to Rish Lakish, that the cloud covered Moshe Rabbeinu for 6 days, and only on the 7th day Moshe was invited in. My sheishes yomim. So zeh bona of. That means the question really is, why do I need the words sheishes yomim if it already says that Hashem called Moshe on the 7th day? So just say that there was a cloud there, and on the 7th day Hashem called Moshe. What does it mean that the cloud covered him for 6 days? It must be teaching us bona of. This is a teaching for all other cases. Anyone who goes into the camps where Hashem's presence is felt more than anywhere else. This is not referring to the regular machne shchina. This is referring to going into the kodesh kadoshim. Ton prishas shisha, that it needs a separation period of 6 days. Says the Gemara, v'hanan shivotnan. So Rabbi Yochanan is asking Rish Lakish, so the source Rish Lakish, that a Kohen Gadol who's going to go into the Kodesh Kadoshim on Yom Kippur, that he needs Prisha, is from Sinai. You only see 6 days Prisha. In our Mishnah it says they would separate the Kohen 7 days. Says the Gemara, Masnisin Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. Our Mishnah is following Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, and indeed only 6 of the 7 days are a biblical requirement learnt from Sinai. The 7th day, that extra day, is a rabbinical one. The Chayesh, we were worried, the Tumas Beisoi, that if he would be home still that 7th day before Yom Kippur, it could be that Chas v'Shalom, by mistake, he would be boil nida, and then he would be tomei for 7 days and would not be able to do the avodah. And therefore, based on this fear of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, they said that the Kohen should leave his home an extra day earlier, so he should be away from home for the 7 days before Yom Kippur. Continues the Gemara, Omale Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan now said to Rish Lakish, according to how I, Rabbi Yochanan, learn that the source that you need Prisha by Yom Kippur and Parah Aduma is learned from Miluim, the Alifnu mi Miluim, Hainu de Tanya, that's what we learned in the Braisa. We're going to see this on Daf Ches. Zeh v'zeh, that by the Prisha before Yom Kippur and the Prisha before the Sreif HaSapara, Mazin Alav Kol Shiva, they would sprinkle on the Kohen all 7 days, Mikol Chatois Hoyusham, from all the, or a little bit from all the water and ashes of all the paradumos that had been done up until that point. Because even by the Miluim, there was also a concept of sprinkling on the Kohen. It says in the Pasuk, Vayezel Aaron, and Rashi brings that the Psukim, that on the first day of the Miluim, they would sprinkle on Aaron, and they would do the same all the 7 days. However, Rabbi Yochanan says to Rish Lakish that you, the Yalfas Sinai, that the source that there's Prisha by Yom Kippur is from Sinai. Hazar b'Sinai mi'avoy. Was there any concept of Hazar by Sinai? We don't find that they sprinkled Fatara on Klal Yisrael by Sinai. Omalei. So Rabbi Rish Lakish answered back to Rabbi Yochanan, Uletamech minicha, according to you, Rabbi Yochanan, is it any better? B'miluim dam. What did they sprinkle by the Miluim? Blood. Hocha by Sinai, by over here by Yom Kippur and Parah Aduma. What they're sprinkling? Mayin. They're sprinkling water. So it's the same question. You call to you, Rabbi Yochanan, that you're learning Parah and Yom Kippur from Miluim. Why are you sprinkling water? By the Miluim they sprinkled blood. Says the Gemara, Holoi Kasha, that's not difficult. The Tanya Reb Chia, Nichnasu Mayim Tachas Dam, that the water was in place of the blood. In the place, instead of the blood that was sprinkled by Miluim, they would sprinkle water by the Prisha of Yom Kippur and Parah Aduma. Elo l'ditcha bat Rish Lakish. Hazar b'Sinai mi'avoy. Rish Lakish that learn the concept of Prisha from Sinai, then Sinai there was no sprinkling. If there's no sprinkling, where's the sprinkling by Parah Aduma or Yom Kippur come from? Omar Rish Lakish answered him, Maila Ba'alma. This is just a heightened standard, and it's only a rabbinical requirement to do the sprinkling. By Parah Aduma, we already saw this previously, that there was reason that they had to have added high standards of Tahara in order to make up for the fact that they would actually be metame, the kohen who was going to burn the Parah Aduma with the sheretz, in order to counteract the false opinions and ideas of the tzedukim. And by Yom Kippur, since the Kohen Gadol was going to go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, so there was a higher standard of Tahara, and that's why Midrabanon they sprinkled on this Kohen Gadol for the 7 days. But indeed, the sprinkling part was not learnt from Sinai. Continues the Gemara. Tanya Kavased Rabbi Yechanan. Tanya Kavased Rish Lakish. We're going to bring now a brisa that learns like Rabbi Yechanan, that we learn now the prisha of Yom Kippur from Miluim, and we're going to bring a brisa that seems to be like Rish Lakish, that the prisha of Yom Kippur is learned from Sinai. Tanya Kavased Rabbi Yechanan. Where do we see in the brisa that the prisha of Yom Kippur is learned from the Miluim? Because it says in the brisa regarding Yom Kippur, Bezois, with this, Yovoi Aaron el HaKodesh, Aaron HaKohen would come into the Kodesh, Par ben Bokor Lechatos Va'ayil La'oila. Bameh she'omur be'inyan. What does it mean bezois? With this, with what? With something it says in this context. Maihi be'inyan. What does it say in this context? That with it, Aaron HaKohen was coming to the Beis HaMikdash, was being prepared for the Yom Kippur. The Miluim. That in this context of the Avodah of Yom Kippur, there's also the concept of Miluim is mentioned there. And in the Yerushalmi says that the fact that in the parasha Nacharemois, which is the parasha of the Avodah of Yom Kippurim, it mentions that Aaron HaKohen's 2 sons were nifta. And when were they nifta? By the Miluim. So the fact that the Aaron HaKohen's, the p'tira of his sons are mentioned, that is the concept of Miluim, which is mentioned within the context of the Avodah Yom Kippurim. B'zois yavo Aaron el HaKodesh, with Miluim. Learn something from Miluim regarding Yom Kippur. What do we learn from Miluim? We learn that in the same way as Miluim, there's Prisha, so too, before Yom Kippur, there should be Prisha. Uma Omur Be'inyan Miluim. What does it say in Miluim that we then say that applies also to Yom Kippur? That Aaron Pirish Shiva, that he separated himself for 7 days, V'shimish Yom Echad, and then on that 8th day, on that Rosh Chodesh Nisan, he did the Avodah. Moshe, in those 7 days, Moshe Mosalo Kol Shiva, K'dei Lechanchi B'Avodah. Moshe Rabbeinu will teach him the Avodah for the 7 days in order that he should know what to do on the 8th day. After so too in all future generations regarding Yom Kippur, Kohen Gadol Pirish Shiva, the Kohen Gadol would separate himself for 7 days, as we saw in our Mishnah on Daf Beis Amud Aleph, Umeshamish Yom Echad, and then he would serve. And only he would serve, it would be his day, Yom Kippur, where he would do the Avodas. Ushnei Talmidei Chachomim miTalmidov shel Moshe. There would be 2 Talmidei Chachomim who are considered disciples of Moshe Rabbeinu. Says the Gemara, Lafukei Tzedukim, and that's to exclude the Tzedukim who made changes to the tradition that they had of how to do the Yom Kippur Avodah. And those 2 Talmidei Chachomim, Moiserin lo Kol Shiva, they would teach him all 7 days, K'dei Lechanchoi, to train him ba'Avodah. So you should know the Avodah for Yom Kippur. Mikan Omru, from here, from this Bezois Yova Aaron el HaKodesh, we have a source that Shivas Yomim Kodim Yom Kippurim, 7 days prior to Yom Kippur, Mafrishin Kohen Gadol Mibeisei, we separate the Kohen Gadol from his home, Lilishkas Parhedrin, to this chamber called Parhedrin in the Beis HaMikdash, as we saw in the Mishnah on Daf Beis Amud Aleph. Ukashem Shemafrishin Kohen Gadol, in the same way as before Yom Kippur there was a 7-day separation period, Kach Mafrishin Kohen Aserifis Apara, so too the Kohen that would burn the Parah Aduma, and this was the first Gemara we saw in Daf Beis Amud Aleph, that we separated Lelishkosh al Pnei Bira, to a chamber that was facing Bira. Bira is either the Harabais or the Beis HaMikdash. Tzafayna Mizracha, on the northeast side or corner. And the Gemara on Daf Beis explained to us what the significance of that was. Ve'echod zeh, mazin alav kol shiva. And also, as we saw before, also the Kohen that was doing the 7 days before Yom Kippur, and the Kohen that was 7 days Prisha before the Paraduma. On both of them, they would sprinkle on him 7 days, Mikol Chatoyis Shoyisham, from all the Paradumas that were there up until that point. V'im Toimar b'miluim dam. You can ask a question that the sprinkling that was done by the miluim was blood. Hochamaim, but over here in the case of the Kohen before burning the Paraduma, or the Kohen Gadol before the Avodas Yom Kippurim, Maim was sprinkled with water. Omras nichnasu Maim tachas dam, that the water was there in place of instead of the blood, they would do water. V'oimer, and the Brisa says, and there's another source as well, that from where we learn that the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur and the Kohen before burning a Parah Aduma has to separate 7 days. And this is the pasuk we saw already previously. Kasher also b'yom hazeh, in the same way as there was a halacha of Prisha by the Miluim, Tziva Hashem la'asos lechaper aleichem. What does that mean? Hashem commanded you should do it to have atonement. La'asos is elu ma'aseh parah, lechaper elu ma'aseh Yom Kippurim. This is the pasuk we saw previously, that there was a source we learned from Miluim, Gzeres HaKosov, that also before Yom Kippur, also before burning the Parah Aduma, there's a 7-day Prisha. So from this Brisa we see clearly that from where do we learn the 7 days Prisha before Yom Kippur? From Miluim, and this is proof to Rabbi Yechanon's opinion. Now the Gemara is going to discuss a couple of points in this Brisa. V'hai bezois. How's the Brisa learning that you need the first source in the Brisa, that you need Miluim, you need Prisha before Yom Kippur? Because it says bezois, come with this to Yom Kippur. And what's this? Something mentioned in the parasha in the context of Yom Kippur. What is that? Miluim. And so I explained to you according to how the Yerushalmi explains it. But the Gemara is first asking a question I don't understand. Hai bezois miboilei legufei. I need it for itself. What does it say in the pasuk? Bezois yave Aaron el hakodesh. The Aaron will come with this, with what? Bepar ben bokor lechatos va'ayil la'oila. With a par and an ayil. So I need the zois to say, come with this. I don't need bezois to say, come with this idea, with a concept, come with prisha that's learnt out from Miluim. The word is not spare to teach us that. Says the Gemara, yes. They answered, Ila korban nechudei, if it would be just a korban, it would say, Leima kra bezeh. Come with this, with using the word bezeh, which is a masculine term. Oy ba'ele, or with these, in masculine. My bezois, what's this in feminine phrase? Shamas minotarity, to teach us also Prisha is a concept in Lashon HaKodesh which is used in Lashon Nekeva, and the bezois is alluding to the fact that there's something which is a Lashon Nekeva which also has to accompany you to Yom Kippur. What is that? That's the Prisha that is learnt out from the Miluim. And then the Gemara is asking, my v'omer, at the end of the Brisa we saw that it brings a second pasuk, as if the first pasuk is not sufficient. What wouldn't be sufficient with the bezois yova Aaron el hakodesh, that we would need the second pasuk of kasha also b'yom hazeh tziva Hashem la'asos lechaper aleichem. Says the Gemara, my v'omer v'chi teima, because it's explaining as follows. The pasuk that says bezois yova Aaron el hakodesh, the Aaron HaKohen should come with this, and we said this. What's this? It means Prisha. I may have thought that that's only Yom Kippur Kamo. It's only the very first Yom Kippur. Who the boy Prisha? That needs Prisha. Kada Ashkechon b'miluim. Like Miluim, the inauguration was just once, that first time. Maybe that first Yom Kippur, you need the Prisha. But Yom Kippurim, but the Alma, but all the following years, right through the generations, who says you need Prisha before Yom Kippur? Loi, maybe not. Inami, or I may have thought, Kohen Gadol Kamo. Who the boy Prisha? Maybe only the very first Kohen Gadol, Aaron HaKohen, like he did the inauguration, so too, when his Yom Kippur, even all the Yom Kippurs, but only that where Aaron HaKohen was acting and serving as the Kohen Gadol, he needs Prisha. Aval Kohen Gadol ba'alma, maybe any other Kohen Gadol after him, Loi does not need Prisha. Tashema, that's why the Brisa brings the second pasuk, Kasha also v'chulu. From that pasuk you see that in all the generations, whatever was done by Miluim was done before Yom Kippur with the Kohen Gadol. So that's as far as the Brisa is concerned, that's proof to Rabbi Yechanon, that we learned the Prisha of Yom Kippur and Paraduma from the Prisha of Miluim. Now the Gemara says, Tani Kavasei Rish Lakish. Now we're going to have a Brisa like Rish Lakish, that the source that one has to do Prisha before Yom Kippur is from Sinai. What does it say in the Brisa? The Brisa says, let's go back to to Rish Lakish at the bottom of Daf Gimel Amud Beis that we started with today, that Rish Lakish asked Rabbi Yochanan that he had a problem with the fact that you learn out the Prisha of Yom Kippur from Miluim because of it's not Ma'akev. So he says Yalif Lo Misinai Dichsiv, and he brings the pasuk. What does it say in the pasuk? 4 lines from the bottom of Daf Gimel Amud Beis. Vayishkoin Kvoid Hashem al Har Sinai. The honor of Hashem rested on Sinai. Vayichasehu he'onon, and the cloud covered it. Sheishes Yomim, 7 days. Vayikra al Moshe b'yom hashvi, and on the 7th day, Hashem called Moshe mitaycha onon, from within the cloud. So says the Brisa, Moshe ola ba'onon. Moshe Rabbeinu went up into the cloud, v'niskase ba'onon, and was covered over by the cloud. V'niskadish ba'onon, he became purified, sanctified in the cloud. It was a spiritual cloud, obviously. Kedei lekabel Torah leYisrael b'kedusha, in order that he should receive the Torah for Klal Yisrael in a matzav of kedusha. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, Vayishka in Kvoid Hashem al Har Sinai, that Hashem rested His honor on Har Sinai. We know that on that first Shavuos, we'll soon see when it was, either on the 6th or the 7th of Sivan, where Klal Yisrael received, or they heard, the Aseres HaDibros, and after that, Moshe Rabbeinu, on the 7th of Sivan, Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Shamayim in order to actually receive the Luchos. 40 days later, he came down with the Luchos on Shiva B'Tammuz. Unfortunately, he saw they were engaged in the Egel. He broke those first Luchos. But when did he go up? After hearing the Aseres HaDibros, in order to receive the Luchos, that's when he went up. And when it says Vayishkoin Kvoid Hashem al Har Sinai Vaychaseu Onon Sheishes Yomim, etc., when did all that happen? It wasn't the 6 days before Matan Torah, and B'yom Hashvi was not the day of Matan Torah. It was after Matan Torah. The cloud covered, not only covered the mountain, it covered Moshe Rabbeinu, and that was the 6 days that Moshe was secluded in the mountain. On the 7th day after Matan Torah, Hashem called him up, so to speak, and then he was there for the 40 days to receive the Luchos. So this is Achar Aseres HaDibros Shehoyu Tchilo L'Arboim Yom, the beginning of that means the first 6 days, that was the 40 days where he would receive the Luchos. Then there were these 7 days, Divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So you see clearly that there was a Prisha there 6 days before Moshe Rabbeinu went up to receive the Luchos from Hashem. And this is the proof to Rish Lakish that there's a concept of Prisha. Because we're soon going to see, Rabbi Akiva says that pasuk that we mentioned is actually referring to the 6 days before Matan Torah. The 6 days before Matan Torah, is it correct that Moshe Rabbeinu was covered by the cloud the 6 days? Certainly not. The Psukim tell us that in those 6 days before Matan Torah, Moshe went up, Moshe came down, he was giving over messages to Klal Yisrael, and from Klal Yisrael back to Hashem, discussed extensively in the Gemara in Perek Rabbi Akiva in Masechet Shabbos. So it's and according to that, when it says Vayichaseyu he'onon sheishes yomim, it was just the cloud was covering the mountain for the 6 days before Matan Torah. It was not covering Moshe. If it was not covering Moshe, then there's no source for Prisha there. However, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that these were the 6 days after Matan Torah, where it doesn't say that Moshe came out of the cloud, then indeed Moshe Rabbeinu was covered by the cloud. So you have a proof that there's Prisha. There's proof there's Prisha. This will be a source that whenever one goes right close to Hashem, so to speak, one needs 6 days Prisha before it. And that's the proof to Rish Lakish. Now the Bryce is continuing, that's Rabbi Yossi Aglili's opinion. Rabbi Akiva argues and says, the Vayishka in Kvoid Hashem, when did Hashem's honor rest on the mountain? That was Miresh Chodesh. It was the 6 days before Matan Torah. It was from Rosh Chodesh, Sivan, Vayichaseyu ha'onon lahar. And what did the cloud cover? Not Moshe Rabbeinu, because Moshe Rabbeinu kept coming out. It only is talking about covering the mountain, and then there's no source whatsoever that there was Prisha there. Vayikra el Moshe. Then when it says in the pasuk that on the 7th day Hashem called Moshe, this also needs to be understood. What happened on the 7th day? On the 7th day Hashem gave us the Torah. He just called Moshe. He called all of us. We were all invited to Har Sinai. We were all invited to Matan Torah. So why does it say in the pasuk Vayikra el Moshe? So it says the Brayso V'chol Yisrael oimdim. And not only was Moshe called, the whole of Klal Yisrael was called to stand there. And the reason the Torah singles out Moshe was just to give Moshe the honor as being a very unique individual. He was the one that was going to bring down the Torah to us, and some of the dibros were said to Moshe Rabbeinu. So therefore Moshe Rabbeinu was singled out, but it wasn't a calling unique to Moshe Rabbeinu. And however, according to Rabbi Aglili, the first opinion, that says that we're talking here about the 6 days after Matan Torah, that Moshe was in the cloud. And then the 7th day, Hashem called Moshe to come up and get the luchos. That was unique to Moshe Rabbeinu. That's the first two opinions in the Brisa. Reb Nosson actually follows Rabbi Aglili. Rabbi Aglili says that the 6 days was after Matan Torah, and the 7th day was unique to Moshe Rabbeinu. He was called to come up. Then you're going to ask, why did Moshe Rabbeinu need these 6 days of preparation? Reb Nosson says, even though I agree with Rabbi Aglili that these 6 days of separation were there was 6 days of Prisha, but it's not because he was going into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, so to speak, into the Mokim HaShechina. And indeed, according to Reb Nosson, there's no source that you always need Prisha before going into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Rather, he says that was unique to Moshe Rabbeinu, that it was important that Moshe Rabbeinu would become elevated to the level of being an angel, a malach. And to be a malach, you can't have food in your system, because malachim don't eat, and therefore he had to wait for the 6 days before to make sure that all the food and drink in his body had cleaned out. And then Moshe Rabbeinu went up in an angelic state. And therefore there's no source from here that one has to do Prisha. Reb Masechet ben Chorosh says that the 6 days, again, he holds like Rabbi Aglili that they were after Matan Torah, before Moshe Rabbeinu was going up to receive the luchos. And it was not a general Prisha because before going into the Shechina you need Prisha. No, it was just in order to instill fear on Moshe Rabbeinu, in order that the Torah, the luchos, should be given to Moshe with trembling and with shaking. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, Ivdu es Hashem b'yira, you should serve Hashem with awe. V'gilu bir'oda, and rejoice in trepidation. My v'gilu bir'oda, what does it mean you should rejoice in trepidation? It would seem to be a contradiction. You cannot rejoice at the same time as being fearful. Omer b'ad bar masna, omarav, b'mokim gilo, in a place where there is rejoicing, shom teira oda, there should be trembling. Where is there rejoicing? The rejoicing is when you get the luchos. Rashi says, Matan Torah shel luchos, tichsev p'kudei Hashem yesharim mesamchei leiv. We're going to receive the mitzvahs, we're going to receive the Torah of the luchos. Is something which very much is reason for rejoicing. Tosfos says, oiz v'chedva bimkoimoi. There's a concept when getting the Torah is something we rejoice with. We rejoice, it has to have a certain trembling. In order that Moshe should be in that state, he was secluded from everyone else. He had to stay on his own, and that would prepare him for going up to receive the Torah of the luchos. So we have three opinions that say that the 6 days were after Matan Torah, before Moshe went up to get the luchos, but only according to one of these opinions, it was actually because he's going into the Machne Shechina, and only according to that opinion of Rabbi Aglili, and we saw Rish Lakish follows that, is that it's a binyan av to teach us that whenever you go into the Kodesh Kodashim, namely a Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur, needs the days of Prisha. Says the Gemara, what was the point that they were arguing in? That Rabbi Akiva says that it was the 6 days that the cloud was on the mountain 6 days before Matan Torah, and Rabbi Aglili says that it was the 6 days after Matan Torah, before going up to get the luchos. Says the Gemara, Pluk to Dahani Tanoi. Well, remember, we learned this in Masechet Yoma Daf Pevov, that there's another machlekes, and they seem to be arguing on the same points. The Beshisha b'chodesh nitna Torah liYisrael. Tanakama say, the Tani we learned in the Brisa, the Tanakama say that on the 6th of Sivan, Torah, the Aseres HaDibros were given to Klal Yisrael. Rabbi Yossi says, B'shiva boy. And exactly the calculations and where the Tanakam and Rabbi Yossi learned it from is something we learnt about at length in Shabbos Daf Pevov. So Manda Omar B'Shisha, According to the opinion that the Torah was given on the 6th of Sivan, then b'shisha nitna, Torah was given on the 6th, u'b'shiva ola, and on the 7th of Sivan, Moshe Rabbeinu went up to receive the luchos. Man da'amar b'shiva. However, according to the opinion which is Rabbi Yossi, who says that the Torah was given on the 7th, b'shiva nitna, Torah was given on the 7th of Sivan, u'b'shiva ola, and it has to also be that on the 7th, in this point there's no machlokes, we'll soon see why, everybody agrees Moshe Rabbeinu went up on the 7th of Sivan to get the luchos. So now the Gemara is explaining. Rabbi Aglili holds Ketanikama da Omar b'shisha b'chodesh nitna Torah. He says that Torah was given on the 6th day of Sivan. Hilkoch ze hoyom maisa achar aseret hadibros. So when it says that it was Bayom Shvi and Hashem called Moshe, what would that mean? Hashem called Moshe to receive the Torah, according to the opinion that says that, according to Rabbi Aglili, let's say the other way around. According to Rabbi Akiva, what was the Bayom Shvi? That Hashem called Moshe to receive the Torah. As we saw at the top of Amud Beis, that the question was even, why was Moshe called more than the rest of Klal Yisrael were called? We were all called to receive the Aseres HaDibros, nothing to do with the Luchos. When it says Bayom Shvi, according to the Tanakama, the Torah was given on the 6th, not on the 7th. So how are we going to understand that? And therefore, Rabbi Aglili was forced to say that if we're discussing a Bayom Shvi, it must be that the 6 days, or those 7 days, were after Matan Torah. There were 7 days of Prisha, and then, or the 6 days of Prisha, and then on the 7th day, Moshe was called up to get the luchos, and that was only Moshe. That was the opinion of Rabbi Aglili. Who did the cloud cover? Not just the mountain, according to Rabbi Aglili, it was Moshe. It covered Moshe, and it was Moshe's Prisha. And on the 7th day, Moshe was called Likabule Shar Torah to come up to Shemaim and receive the luchos, the rest of the Torah. If you're going to learn like Rabbi Akiva learned, that Vayishkren Kvod Hashem is the days before Matan Torah, and when it says that the clouds covered the mountain, it was not referring exclusively to Moshe, because we know that Moshe came out of the mountain and went backwards and forwards to Klal Yisrael. So it was Vayichaseu Onon. What was the cloud covering? Laharo, just covering the mountain. Vayikra El Moshe B'Yom HaShvi. What was the Bayom Shvi? Lekabule Aseres HaDibros. That was the day where they received the Torah. Hokabilu Lom B'Shisha. It cannot be that he received the Torah, that by Bayom Shvi on the 7th day, Hashem called them to receive the Aseres HaDibros, according to the Tanakama. It was on the 6th of Sivan. So it must be that if you follow the Tanakama, you have to say that the Bayom Shvi was following 6 days, and all that was after Matan Torah. Voistalik Onon Mishisha, because if the Torah was given, when it says that the cloud covered the mountain for 6 days, and then after that, the mountain, the cloud dispersed, the clouds left. So if the 6 days were before Matan Torah, then on the 6th day of Sivan they received the Torah, and when after they received the Torah, the mountain left them. The pasuk says that Hashem called Moshe, Vayikra el Moshe Bayom Shvi mitoicha onon. Hashem called Moshe from within the cloud. So if you say that the cloud was only covering the mountain, logic dictates that as soon as Matan Torah was over, the cloud left the mountain on the 6th day. If you say that it was talking about the 6 days of Prisha of Moshe Rabbeinu himself, the cloud was covering Moshe. If it was covering Moshe, then it's comfortable to assume that the cloud stayed there even to the 7th day. There's no reason the cloud should have gone away after 6 days. But if the cloud just covered the mountain as preparation for Matan Torah, when Matan Torah was over on the 6th day of Sivan, then the cloud would have gone away. So what does it mean Hashem called Moshe on the 7th day from within the cloud? So it must be, this is Rabbi Aglili saying, I hold that Matan Torah was on the 6th day of Sivan, and then after Matan Torah started, from the next day, started the 6 days of Prisha of Moshe Rabbeinu. He was in the cloud, and then on the 7th day Hashem called him to come and get the luchos. Rabbi Akiva Sova, how Rabbi Akiva holds, Sova lok Rabbi Yossi. He holds like Rabbi Yossi, the Omar b'Shiva b'Chodesh nitna Torah liYisrael, that Matan Torah was on the 7th of Sivan, and therefore the 6 days mentioned in the Pasuk could be the 6 days that the cloud was on the mountain. On the 7th day was Matan Torah, and then on the 7th day the cloud could have gone away. And according to Rabbi Akiva, on the 7th day, the day of Matan Torah, Hashem called Moshe, not only Moshe was singled out, as we saw before, Lachle Kovid LeMoshe, but everybody was called on the 7th day to receive the Torah. Says the Gemara, Bishleim Rabbi Akiva, according to Rabbi Akiva, the cheshbon works out, because we know that Moshe Rabbeinu came down after 40 days, when the entire 40 days in Shemaim, and then on the 40th day, on the next day, he came down, and it was Shiva B'Tammuz, the day that he broke the luchos. So according to Rabbi Akiva, that Matan Torah was on the 7th, and after Matan Torah, on that day, on the 7th, Moshe Rabbeinu went up. 40 days later was Shiva B'Tammuz. It works out with Shiva B'Tammuz, Nishtabra Luchos, like the Mishnah says in Tainis, that on the Shiva B'Tammuz, the luchos were broken. Why? Esrim Arba de Sivan. Because Matan Torah was on the 7th. From the 7th to Sivan, to the end of Sivan, is 24 days. V'shitzar de Tammuz, and another 16 days to complete the 40 days in Shemayim of Tammuz. The next day, on day 41, he came down. Milule Arboim Yoimim, to have a Bahar. He has 40 full days on the mountain. Or B'shivsar b'Tammuz, on the 17th of Tammuz, Nochis, Moshe came down. Nochis v'Asi he came down. V'tavrinu leluchis, and he broke the luchis when he saw the Egel. According to Rabbi Yossi, who says that, as we saw before, Rabbi Yossi Aglili learns that there were 7 days of Prisha, 6 days of Prisha after Matan Torah. So Matan Torah was, as we saw before, Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds Matan Torah was on the 6th. On the 7th started 6 days of Prisha, and then Hashem on the 7th day called him up, and we assume that 40 days started on that day 7. You have an extra 6 days. Varboim Dahar is ad Esrim Utlas B'Tammuz Leid Bar Luchos. The luchos only got smashed on the 23rd of Tammuz, 46 days after Matan Torah, not 40 days after Matan Torah. Omelach Rabbi Yossi Aglili would answer you, no. Arboim Dahar Behadi Shisha de Prisha. The 40 days included the 6 days of Prisha. On day 7 of Sivan, everyone agrees that the Moshe Rabbeinu started his 40 days. According to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, it was the first 6 days were Prisha days. From day 7, Hashem called him up until the end of those 40 days. Then Moshe Rabbeinu was up receiving the luchos. Continues the Gemara, Omar Mar. We saw when we were learning the opinion of Rabbi Akiva at the bottom of Daf Daled Amud Aleph, going on to Daled Amud Beis, Rabbi Akiva Omer, Vayishkein Kved Hashem is Merosh Chodesh. Rabbi Akiva learned, not like Rabbi Yossi Aglili, he said that the 6 days that the cloud was covering the mountain, not covering Moshe Rabbeinu. And the 7th day was Matan Torah. The Gemara is now saying, Omar Mar, Vayikral Moshe v'chol Yisrael oimdim. And this is what we saw before at the top of the Amud. There wasn't only Moshe, it was all of Klal Yisrael was standing there to receive the Torah. Moshe was singled out in respect for Moshe, who was a very important part of Matan Torah. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Elazar, this is proof to Rabbi Elazar. To Amar Rabbi Elazar, Vayikral Moshe v'chol Yisrael oimdim. Exactly what we saw before. Rabbi Elazar said that Moshe and the rest of Klal Yisrael were standing there. And the reason that it says that Moshe was called is in order to give respect and honor to Moshe Rabbeinu. Continues the Gemara Meisvei. We learned in the Brisa, Koil Loi, Koil Elov. It says in the Pasuk, Ubavoy Moshe el Oil Moed, when Moshe would come to the Oil Moed, to the Mishkan, L'daber itoi, to speak to the Shechina, Vayishma es hakoil medaber Elov, and you would hear the sound, the voice speaking to him. Elov. Says the Gemara, Koil Loi. It would have been enough to say that he heard the koil, the sound, to him. What does it mean that Elov? It's a different term. Koil Elov is to teach us that Moshe Shoma v'chol Yisrael lo yishomu. It's not just that Moshe went in to hear Hashem speaking to him. No, the voice was only directed at Moshe, exclusively. Nobody else could hear Hashem's voice speaking to Moshe. So how can you say before, you Rabbi Akiva say, that when it says Vayikra Moshe, when Hashem called Moshe, it wasn't only to Moshe. All of Klal Yisrael heard this calling, come to receive the Torah on the 7th of Sivan. But so how can you say that when Hashem spoke to Moshe, it was directed, so to speak, at Moshe, everybody else could hear? We just saw here that when Hashem spoke to Moshe, nobody else could hear. Says the Gemara, Lo Kasha. That's not a question. There's a fundamental difference between when Hashem spoke to Moshe regarding inviting him to receive the Torah on Har Sinai, the Aseres HaDibros on the 7th of Sivan, to when he was speaking to him afterwards from the Mishkan, from the Oil Moed. Har Sinai, when Hashem spoke to Moshe at Sinai, everybody could hear. Har Oil Moed, the pasuk that says Elov, that only Moshe could hear, that was talking about from the Mishkan. Or you can answer, Lo Kasha, Har Kriya, Har Dibur. It depends whether when Hashem was just calling or whether he was speaking, having a dialogue. When he was speaking to Moshe, only Moshe would hear. When he would call, everybody else could hear. Continues the Gemara. Reb Zrika asked a seeming contradiction between two psukim in front of Rebbe Loza. Others say that Omer Reb Zrika, Rebbe Loza Rami. Others say that Reb Zrika related that it was Rebbe Loza who asked the question. Ksiv in one pasuk it says, "V'lo yochel Moshe lovoi el oil moed." Moshe couldn't come into the oil moed ki shochan olova onon, because the cloud of Hashem's Shechina was resting on it. Uchsiv, but in contrast to that, it seems to say by Har Sinai, "Vayovoi Moshe b'soicha onon," that Moshe Rabbeinu came into the cloud. There was a cloud by Har Sinai, and it says that Moshe came into the cloud. Vayale lahor vayhi Moshe b'hor arboim yom v'arboim laila. Melamed, what do we see from there? It must be that Moshe couldn't go in on his own. Hashem had to take hold of Moshe Rabbeinu and bring him into the cloud. Hashem can do anything. Hashem can bring anyone anywhere. Moshe on his own couldn't come into the cloud. That was one explanation, one answer of this seeming contradiction. That indeed Moshe couldn't go on his own. Deber b'shmal tana, ne'emar kan b'soich, v'ne'emar la'alon b'soich. That it says over there in that pasuk, Vayovi Moshe b'soiche onon, Moshe came into the cloud, and it says by Kriyas Yamsuf, Vayovoyu b'nei Yisrael b'soich hayom vayabosha. The cloud Yisrael went into the water. How could they go into the water? It's almost as impossible as going into the cloud of the Shechina. Ma'ala alon, in the same way as Bahar Sinai, Shvil, there was a path that was made for Klal Yisrael through which they could go through the water. It says in the pasuk, V'hamayim lehem choyma, that's the continuation of that pasuk, that the water was for them a wall on both sides. Miminam u'mismailam, afkan, so too, that when Moshe Rabbeinu had to go into the cloud, Hashem made a path, so to speak, separated the cloud to allow Moshe to come in. And this, the Rosh Hashanah explains, this is a second answer to that seeming contradiction. Continues the Gemara. Vayikra el Moshe vayidaber. The pasuk says, Vayikra el Moshe vayidaber Hashem elov me'oil moed leimor. That Hashem called Moshe, and then he spoke to him from the oil moed. Lama hiktim kriya ledibur. Why did Hashem have to call Moshe? He should just start talking to him. Says the Gemara, Limda Torah derech eretz. The Torah was teaching us what is the right way of behaving. You shouldn't just start talking to your friend, elim kein koreu, unless you call him and address him first. It's proof to Rav Chanina, the Omer of Chanina, lo yomer adam davar lechaveri elim kein koreu. You shouldn't start speaking to your friend unless you address him first. Says the Gemara. Then that same pasuk it says, Vayikra Moshe vaydaber Hashem elov me'oil moed leimor. To speak. What's the word? Why did Hashem have to say leimor, to speak? Omer of Musya, bar bereder of Masya, mishmeder of Musya Rabbah, in the name of Reb Musya the Great. Minayin la'omer davar lechaveri. What's the source? That when you say something to your friend, shahu b'bal yomer, that friend should not say it over to anyone else, until you tell him, go, I give you permission to say it over. Shneimar, as it says in the pasuk, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe, Vaydaber el Moshe, Vayikra el Moshe, Vaydaber Hashem elov me'oil moed leimor. And Rashi says the word leimor actually means loy emor advarim. Leimor means, I'm telling you something, don't say it unless you get explicit permission. When I give you explicit permission, leimor, then you can say it over, not before then. And in Mirz Hashem, in the next shiur, we're going to continue from here.